very much, Louise, for that introduction. I think maybe the reason he said that I'm somebody you can learn from is not necessarily because I'm particularly cleverer than anybody else on this topic. It's just that the chance of circumstance over the last 20 years put me in a place where integrated assessment was beginning to grow. I was in the European Environment Agency from the very start, if not from before the beginning, and this was the practice. So I was kind of thrown into this space and was part of this whole development cycle. And so from that just chance-wise appearance on the scene early on in integrated assessment around 1990, I've carried out my whole professional career through this developmental area. So it's just in some ways the coincidence of my journey, but it's also been a privilege and responsibility to be a kind of a witness to this journey, and to understand what does it mean for the work that we do at the European Environment Agency and we do across the INET about making sure that we have the knowledge available for making sound environmental decisions, to support policymakers and other types of decision makers. So I will attempt in this lecture to give you some of the fundamentals. I'll give you some of the history. I'll tell a few stories of what's been happening in this area. I will try to give you the what, the why, and the how of integrated environmental assessment, and then also talk about some challenges and where they are now maybe already challenging the fundamentals of what we're doing, which means that we need to go back to those fundamentals to ensure that when we do continue in this practice, we're understanding where it comes from and what the approaches are. Because really, the work that we do in environmental agencies and ministries across Europe very much depend on a sound pedigree of environmental information. And if we don't have that, then we're going to be open to criticism and the power of that knowledge is going to be undermined. So it's very important that we know where things come from and what our approaches are. So I'll be focusing on that in this lecture to try to explain a little bit about where it's come from and how we are developing that still in the future. I think already one of the things that was mentioned was about this work is a bit of a craft. It's an activity which we are working together on. We're co-generating. Actually, integrated assessment is very much a craft skill. It's to do with people working together. So I think actually the nature of this summer school, which is a kind of a co-generation, working together activity, is very suitable to the whole area of integrated environmental assessment. So let me maybe start from the beginning and give you a timeline. So this timeline takes us from 1968, when we first saw ourselves in the satellite. I remember I saw that myself when I was a teenager back then, and was very taken by the fact that the Earth is a separate planet that we could look at, and how lonely and fragile that was. As you go along this line, what we've tried to do here is to emphasize the different types of events and assessments that have been produced along the way. And as you see, there's been many different types of events along the way, which you know about very much, of course, the 1972 Stockholm Conference, the 92 Rio Conference, the following conferences at the European level. And each one of these political and social gatherings usually had some type of assessment and information associated with it. So we've tried to plot those along this line, particularly from the agency's point of view, the European Environment Agency's point of view. We began life in around 1994. Actually, we began life in around 1989, which was when the first ideas, the publication of the regulation was in 1990, but the first ideas came before then, about saying Europe needs a consistent agency to look across the information and data and provide a European view, not just a jigsaw puzzle pieces all together of the different countries. So that's really part of the agenda here. And just before then, if you remember, there were a number of important accidents, like the Sandoz accidents on the River Rhine, also the Chernobyl accident. And in fact, one of the origins of the European Environment Agency was Jacques Delors looking at the first maps of cesium-137 deposition and seeing, what is this? I can see the border lines of France and Germany and Italy. Surely, if this is a natural deposition, I should say deposition of artificial radionuclides, but done in a natural way due to the rain and the winds, then why are we seeing the borders? And of course, the answer was that people in the different countries were measuring the environmental contamination, the radioactivity, in different ways. So there was not a consistent view. And so that was one of the first things when Jacques Delors saw this. He said, we actually need an agency for the whole of Europe to join together and make a much more consistent picture. So that's a very important part of our story. And as we go on, we have the very first Dobrich assessment, which I was also very privileged to be a part of and an editor of at the very start of the opening up politically and socially of Europe. And we developed this pan-European State of Environment report, the first time that had been done, trying to stitch together all these pieces. And then going through at the UNEP level, also at that time, the Global Environmental Outlooks began at around 1995, the first one in 1997. And we were also part of that journey, trying to develop these assessments, always having in the back of my mind that this is to do with integrated environmental assessment. Not just what is the quality of water or what is the quality of air, bringing it all together in an integrated view. So also this timeline talks about these different global assessments that we've been involved with, and they've also been struggling with the concept and practice of integrated environmental assessment. More recently, you look and we see the developments in 2015 on the Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, these now are very much center stage about how we're going to track progress in a sustainability setting. And I think behind measuring the progress of these sustainability goals, integrated assessment, again, is needed. There is a tendency there to focus on individual indicators, to say, are we making progress? It goes up, yes, we're making progress. But actually, behind all of these goals needs to be a proper assessment, not just an individual indicator, which gives you an impression. That's what an indicator is supposed to do, but doesn't actually give you the full story. So success in the Sustainable Development Goals requires a good grasp and practice of integrated environmental assessment. And so on and so forth into the future, and I'll talk about some of those other challenges soon that we're coming. So what I'm trying to point out here is that the history of integrated environmental assessment goes back to the beginning of when we tried, scientifically and politically, to understand what is happening to our environment. And they're trying to bring together all those pieces, beginning very much from a scientific basis, but taking that scientific understanding into a social and political dialogue and discourse. So we're working here, but in the science policy interface, the connection and interface between those different domains. We're not just talking about the scientific enterprise of integrated assessment modeling, for example. That's a particular field of modeling in the scientific enterprise. We're talking about integrated environmental assessment between the science worlds into the political and social discourse. Science-based, but not science itself. I'll come to that. So, that was by way of introduction in terms of the timeline. We go back quite a long way with this integrated assessment. So what is integrated environmental assessment in terms of a definition? Well, in the early 90s and early 2000s, there was various definitions, there still are, but there's two which I will highlight. First of all, UNEP, in their integrated assessment training manual, talk about assessments, not integrated assessments, assessments, and talk about them as being, I'll just read it so you get the impression, it's the entire analytical process of understanding a critical objective evaluation and analysis of data and information designed to meet user needs and support decision making. So decision making, right there, it's not just policy making. Policy making is a very important area, but decision making as well. It applies the judgment of experts, Okay, the word judgment is very important here. To existing knowledge, to provide scientifically credible answers to policy relevant questions, quantifying where possible the level of confidence. And here it points out, uses the word existing knowledge. Integrated environmental assessment is not a research activity of trying to find out new phenomena, trying to work out the details of climate change, what's really happening, and. No, that's really important stuff, and that'll end up with knowledge which can then be used in integrated environmental assessment. Integrated environmental assessment is not a research activity. You can do research on integrated environmental assessment, of course, but the integrated environmental assessment is based upon really existing knowledge. We take the existing knowledge and we try to say, what does that mean in this social political discourse? What are the consequences of that? Okay? So in this definition, sometimes it's really useful to know what it's not. As I say, it's not a research project. It's not a review. We're not just reviewing. And also, assessments are not advocacy, not trying to promote one idea over another idea because of particular interests. It's quite interesting just to drill down a little bit on this. If I just take what classically could be regarded as a scientific review and a scientific assessment, these are different characteristics. And you see the differences here are very important. So a review is done really by scientists, and it's for the scientists, really, for them. Basically, under review, you often have a narrow topic, but in assessment, you have a much broader topic. You have issues which are, in a review, the issue of judgment is usually quite hidden, whereas in assessment, you have to be very explicit about where you're making your judgments, and so on and so forth. So these differences are really quite important to understand when we're doing something which is more like a review exercise, as opposed to doing a proper assessment exercise. They're different. I won't go into the full details of that. Nevertheless, when you do assessments, they can also be very different between different organizations, between different topics. They can be different, and I've given three ideas here of different types of assessments, from the GEO, the EA reports, and then the report of the environment for the US EPA. Now, these are very, very different types of reports. They're different. They're all assessments. They might also be integrated assessments. Might, I said. But they have differences in scope. They have differences in the conceptual framework. They have differences in terms of the knowledge base, the outputs, as well as the processes which are being followed. But they're still assessments. They're not reviews. Whether or not they're integrated assessments depends on how they're constructed. And I think at the end of this lecture, maybe you'll have some tools to work out whether or not these are integrated assessments. These are three quite characteristic ones from the US EPA, EA, and from UNEP. You should look at those. I won't make an opinion myself, but afterwards we can discuss that. So then, let's move on to discussion on actually what is an integrated environmental assessment, as opposed to just an assessment. Well, this is the EEA definition that we've been using for some time. An integrated environmental assessment is the interdisciplinary and social process. Okay? Social process. Is somebody shocked here? I thought it was a scientific process. Well, actually here what we're doing is emphasizing the fact that it requires interactions between people. Yes, science-based, but it's to do with interactions between people to have an integrated environmental assessment, aimed at identification, analysis, and appraisal of all relevant natural and human processes and their interactions, which determine both the current and the future state of the environment. It's not just looking backwards. So often assessments are saying, why are we where we are, and looking backwards? And we tend to look in the rear view mirror, so to speak, to organize ourselves to go forwards. You know that idea? So you look in the rear view mirror, oh, it's okay behind, so we continue along, right? Actually, if you think of the car metaphor. If you look in the rear view mirror, liable to crash the car, you've got to look ahead as well. So it's looking behind. It's important to know what's behind you, but also you've got to look into the future as well. How do you do that is probably another whole set of lectures. We will touch upon that perhaps. So the current and future state of environmental quality and resources, and an appropriate spatial temporal scales. Very important this. Often assessments have been done in the past at a scale of maybe the country. Well, that's useful for some purposes if you've got indicators for a country, but there's different river basins and ecosystems and cities and whatnot which make a huge difference. So the appropriate spatial and temporal scales, not just every year, it can be every month or every 10 years, thus facilitating the framing and implementation of policies and strategies. Here, note the word framing. It's not just to help implementation of policies. It's also to help, integrated assessment, the thinking of how we might address issues and how we might put them together in a framework which could be useful to the future. Okay, so for example, the Water Framework Directive comes out of thinking and reflections about how the river basins are the most important structure, and that if you don't look at a river basin, you're not going to be able to really tackle improved ecological quality of water. You might just in one spot, but you'll have an effect somewhere else. You've got to frame it with respect to the river basin. That came out of proper integrated assessments, which was the basis of setting off the new framing of the policy in the Water Framework Directive. So very much, we often think of integrated assessments as being downstream, understanding how the policy is working, but actually they're also functioning upstream to help understand how policies can be put together and or where policies perhaps are needed. So that's a kind of a textual definition. Now I will pause at that point, and I will now dive deep into some very fundamental thoughts on which we need to understand and we need to have some reflection about before we then go back up to the surface and think about what is integrated assessment, why should we be doing it, and how we should be doing it. I'll come to that in a moment. But first of all, there's some real fundamental points which we need to understand about knowledge. There's a funny word, epistemology. The nature of knowledge, the origin of knowledge. What is knowledge? How do we get to know what we know? How do I know this and you know that? Big field of philosophy, fascinating field of philosophy. And I'm not going to lecture on that. I probably know that much about it. But I will talk a little bit about two things. First off, post-normal science, and secondly, the nature of the scientific changes and thoughts, what is behind science, basically, and how we know through the framework of scientific approaches and methods. Let me start with this, and I will be, in this lecture, touching on a lot of little things very superficially. My apologies for that, but I hopefully this will give you some interest to read further about these different topics. I can't go into them in great depth, but I'll be touching on them. And this is a very deep and thick topic, but it's very important to have an initial grasp of. And I think this graph captures the concept, and I remember having one of those aha moments, those moments where you've been struggling. I've heard people talk about this. This was in the kind of the mid-90s when we were very lucky to know the authors of this, Jerry Rabbits and Silvio Funtovic. And I thought, what are they talking about? I didn't understand until they put this graph on the table. They said, this is what it's all about. And this graph plots decision stakes, the stakes, what if you make a decision, are the stakes really high about that decision, about in terms of impacts or changes, or are they very low? And system uncertainties. So if you make certain decisions in life, if I just decide now to have a drink of water, it doesn't really matter. You're going to have to wait a second until I've swallowed. But the decision stakes on this side are very, very low. However, if we decide instead to make, for example, think of a high impact decision. If I now decide to walk out of this door, you're going to be left stranded. If I decide to make some sort of component which is going to pollute the environment, it's going to have a large impact, and so on and so forth. So the idea here is to understand what is the possible consequence of the decision. Is there a big consequence or a low consequence? On the system of uncertainties, you're here talking about whether or not it's very clear and understandable about what is going on, or whether there's huge unknowns. And in plotting issues around these areas, you discover that there are three domains. There is a domain around which, this is the green domain, where things kind of function. I mean, we know about the planets going around in their motions. We can predict them really well into the future. And we can work on when there's going to be an eclipse. This is very much applied science, understanding that. The uncertainties are pretty low, and the decision stakes are pretty low about what's going on. Professional consultancy defines an area where there are higher decision stakes and higher uncertainties. But you need some intervention by the professional. Good example is a surgeon. A surgeon is very well in a hospital, knows the medical ins and outs of everything, but when they're doing an operation, suddenly they have to make a decision. They are confronted with something which they were not expecting. And from their knowledge, they work out, this is the best thing to do. So professional consultancy shows that it's not just an equation, you put the numbers in and an answer comes out. There's an interaction and a thinking and intervention by the professionals in order to make a good outcome, because there are higher uncertainties. And the decision stakes are higher. The patient may not recover or not have a good outcome. So this is the area of professional consultancy, science and knowledge in practice, and skillful people who can manage that. What Fudovich and Ravitz postulate is there in fact is a third field. When you have higher uncertainties and higher decision stakes, you cannot just leave it to the professional to say, it's okay, I know what's going on with that nanotechnology, I've done the research, it's all right, trust me, okay? People say, no, I don't want to trust you about that. I actually want to discuss whether or not we need that nanotechnology. I want to know whether it's relevant. I want to know what the possibilities of some crazy outcome might be, or not. It may be a good thing. But there's certain areas where it's not good enough just leave it to the professionals. You need to have what they called and termed an extended peer review. You've got to basically bring people in from many different fields. You've got to bring society into the discussion as well, and work out what it is you're going to do. That's because the uncertainties are high and the decision stakes are high. Climate change obviously is one of these areas. You can't just leave it to the professional. You've got to actually involve everybody in the decisions about what we're going to do about climate change. So what they said, when facts are uncertain, values are in dispute, stakes are high and decisions are urgent, you're in the domain of post-normal science. This affects how we do integrated assessment, how we bring knowledge to the table. It affects the practice of bringing knowledge to the table when we're working with such issues. And so many of the environmental issues we're working with are really in that domain. Not all. We know some things about water and soil, and we know some things about air quality. That's professional consultancy, but when it comes to the more complex systemic issues, we don't. For resolving complex policy issues, scientific demonstration must be complemented by a broad societal dialogue. So this concept of post-normal science, and where we sit in that domain, is fundamental to why it is we need and how it is we carry out an integrated environmental assessment. So that's the lecture on post-normal science. Now, let's take another concept. This is a seminal book. If you've not read it, or then get it and read it. It's a very fundamental book about really how science works and how it changes. Thomas Kuhn, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, published in '62, I believe. And what he postulated there, he reflected on what the scientific method is. Talking about Popper, talking about the disproving the null hypothesis, and he said, yeah, but actually we shift sometimes from one set of thinking into another set of thinking. And actually the scientific process doesn't describe that. actually what we often have is a set of understandings, and we do normal science around those. Then somehow there's a shift, and we have another set of understandings. A good example here is, for example, the whole theory of plate tectonics. When I was at university, this was a theory which was just coming to be accepted. Before, we didn't really understand how the Earth moved around, and there were competing theories and what was going on, until there was absolute evidence from the geomagnetic reversals in the rocks under the ocean, where you could work out that there is a kind of an escalator of moving magma with the Earth opening up, and then subduction zones where the Earth went under itself. And this was revolutionary and changed completely the way of thinking. But the shift from one set of thinking scientifically into another set of thinking was not a scientific process as such. It was a revolution of, this fits the facts better. Okay? And this is what he describes. He describes the different stages. That normal science works, there's some anomalies. You blame often the instrumentation for those anomalies. A good example of that is with the hole in the ozone layer. When this was first observed by Joe Farman, using some very simple equipment, he found this hole. He talked to other scientists and published some work on this, and the NASA scientists who had big instrumentation and satellites said, look, we've got all this wonderful instrumentation, we don't see this hole, so what are you talking about? Obviously you've got some sort of mistake with your instrumentation, blaming the instruments. Actually, they discovered afterwards that what the NASA sophisticated instrumentation and computer programs were doing was that they had identified anomalies. An anomaly was if it wasn't giving us the expected reading. And of course, the unexpected reading was the hole. And so the computer program kind of ignored all of those unexpected readings. And so they didn't see a hole because they said that wasn't possible to see because of their methodology. And actually, it was there. So when you first begin to see anomalies, you tend to blame the apparatus and blame the issues and the people doing the work. You then have some sort of crisis that the problems are too sharp and you need to actually think about another way. And this is really what happened with the hole in the ozone layer and also the plate tectonic theory. But it took much shorter for the hole in the ozone layer. It took much longer for plate tectonics. It took something like 70 years from first notions of plate tectonics. And then there's a change in worldview, a Gestalt shift. It sounds much more important always when it's in German, doesn't it? A Gestalt shift, a change in the framing of thinking. And the example here, which I'll give you from plate tectonics, is that the thing that was keeping in the early 1900s, there was a set of models which are required by the head of the Geological Survey in order to look at shifts in the ground movements. Okay? And he was offered a good number of models by the mathematicians. And there was a model which had shifts like this, horizontal shifts and also vertical shifts, but it was really complex to calculate, lots of calculus and whatever. They didn't have computers then. There was another model that was only up and down, no horizontal movements, and it was simple to compute. So he said, actually, we're going to use this model. It's much simpler to compute, and we want to know what the vertical movements are, so we use that model. 20 years later, in the 1920s, this model now had become the reality. And the head of the Geological Survey at that time, who was confronted already by some evidence about horizontal shifts and plate tectonics, said that, sorry, our model doesn't predict those, so it can't be happening. He had mixed up the model with reality. He'd taken the model as the assumptions. And it was only when there was, as I said earlier, overwhelming evidence from the magnetic reversals that this Gestalt shift could happen. And suddenly people realized, oh wow, it's completely different. And that's a matter of realization, and realizing that your way of thinking can be fitted much better with a different model. So beware of the old professor then, with the old models because they can hold back changes. That's what somebody famous once said. So the Gestalt shift. Then you have a pre-paradigm phase where often there's a lot of alternative concepts going around about what might be the real. Then a new paradigm, and then there's normal science returns, looking at and sharpening a normal paradigm. Now, that idea of how scientific views change is very important, I think, for integrated environmental assessment. Because I think we're in the middle of lots of shifts of thinking about environmental issues, systemic issues, and so on and so forth, that we need to understand. And so we need to be open to understanding where the anomalies lie, where the shifts lie, and maybe the need to shift the way in which we think about the different issues. So that's two underpinning thoughts I thought I'd give you before I go a little bit further about knowledge and the shifts in knowledge in a scientific way, as well as about post-normal science, which we don't often hear about, which underpin integrated environmental assessment. So let me continue now, still a little bit on the what about integrated environmental assessment, about what are the consequences of that, because post-normal science and Kuhn has consequences in the way we look at things. One of the big consequences I've already mentioned is the methodology, who we involve, who we consult, who we work with, the method, the way forward, how we design the process. And another is this framing of the whole issue itself. And so much in the early days of the European Environment Agency, we were asked to tell the Commission what the state of the environment was. And we talk about state of environment reports, don't we? And I remember first coming to the Commission thinking, yeah, so this is the state of the environment, and there's it's there because of these emissions, and it's because there's transport and industry. No, we don't want to know about that, they said. We just want to know about the state of the environment. Yeah, but we're trying to explain why it's like that. No, you don't need to tell us why. Just tell us what the state of the environment is. And we scratched our heads and thought, this is not very useful, because if they just know the state of the environment, how are they going to frame policies so that they can tackle and improve the state? Are they just going to recover? Are they just going to clean it? But then it'll get dirty again, effectively. And so one of the concepts is that we realized that we had to develop a concept, and at that time OECD already had this PSR concept, the pressure state response model, and we said we need to go further. And we through a lot of work we did with at the time some Dutch and some Danish experts, we developed this concept, DPSIR, which identified also other aspects in the area. So we try to pull out as well, not just the state, but also the pressures and the drivers, and make a distinction between not just the emissions, but where are the emissions coming from? The driving forces themselves through agricultural practices, transport, etc. And then what emissions might occur or damages might occur from that. But also we try to pull out the impacts. And the impacts here were ecological impacts, but also economic impacts, maybe health impacts as well. So that our focus, perhaps, as it was thought by the Commission, on the state of the environment could be put in a context and a full model, including also the responses themselves, which then have a reflexive effect on all of the different areas. Now, this sounds pretty obvious to us today, I think. If you think about this model, you know about it, you think, of course we have to do that. Don't assume this. Do not assume this. If you're in a hard political process, those who are bringing information forward will be shut down to say, no, just do your bread and butter, the state of the environment, please. We'll do the rest. You cannot do that. The fundamentals of the system require that we do all of it. In fact, in our regulation, it states that we do all of those things. But still, in the early days, an important person in the Commission, who remained nameless, said to our first director, you stick with the state of the environment, and once you have that, then I'll think about allowing you to do the others. And our director at the time stood up and said, I'm sorry, this is not how we work. We have to do it all or nothing, and walked out of the room. He actually came back, and we had a good conversation, and we agreed in the end. But we agreed because we put this model on the table. It seems very simple today, but do not assume that. It's very important that we do the state of the environment in the context of the whole, and that's what integrated assessment is fundamentally about. You cannot do integrated assessment on the state of the environment without those other parts. So DPSIR is a fundamental framework to make sure we stay within integrated environmental assessment. This is an example of UNEP Global Environment Outlook, which also go beyond the state of the environment. In the early days of developing GEO, there was some kind of reflexive influence because we were part of that process. They developed this kind of building blocks as a set of questions, which actually worked very well. What is happening to the environment and why? What are the consequences for environment and humanity? What is being done and how effective is it? Where are we heading and what action should be taken for a more sustainable future? So this was a set of questions built on each other, and you can see DPSIR embedded within that. And then their integrated assessment will go step by step through the questions and try to answer. It's a very nice, simple set of questions. And actually these are underpinning often a lot of the assessments we're now doing. So integrated assessments, state environment reports now normally do go way beyond the state of the environment because of these first frameworks and the types of questions that have been put together. Another kind of consequence also of some of these fundaments is how we can characterize what can be effective assessments. And there was research done, led initially by Harvard University in the late 90s, but also done in parallel with a European project called EFEA, the European Forum on Integrated Environmental Assessment, that looked at the practice and prospects of integrated environmental assessment and identified different characteristics which are important for effective assessments. And credibility, saliency, and legitimacy were the three top characteristics that came out in this research. First of all, credibility or credible information. So what this is saying is that those assessments which are more effective, what does a more effective mean? Parenthesis, effective is defined here by being recognized, having impact, being quoted, being incorporated perhaps in some policies, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of documentation around what the word effective means. So the characteristics of those which are most effective are those which are credible. In other words, based upon documented good approaches and methodologies, based upon really good information and quality of information, pedigree of information. And the post-normal science paradigm has behind it developed the so-called NUSAP understanding with a different characteristics, with pedigree of data, which is the P, of extremely important. So the concepts there underpin what credible means. Okay? So credible information, something which you can really pinpoint and define. Saliency, relevancy, it simply means relevant, means that an assessment which is addressing a topic of interest to a policymaker or a decision maker is going to be more effective than if you address something that they're not even asking a question about. Now that of course poses a question about, what about a new issue? Well actually you've got to somehow frame it in a discourse that people are interested in. Because if it's beginning to answer a problem and addressing things which are relevant, then it'll support decision makers. And you'll be seen to be actually then useful for the decision maker. Putting yourself in the position to support them in their policy areas means that you become relevant for them and very, very useful for them. So find the niche where you are relevant. That also then gives you the currency, perhaps more, to do things which are not so relevant, and then they'll listen to you. But first of all, get the ones which are relevant. And so we also, at the early days of the agency, began to focus on the environmental action programs of the EU and try to orientate our main state environment reports to support those. This was not really accepted in the early days, but the 1999 Turn of the Century report, which is our second state environment report, was very much focused on the evaluation of the end of the fifth environmental action program. Our first report in 1995, the one Dobrich assessment and a companion volume, was focused on the midterm evaluation of the fifth environmental action program. As I said, that wasn't really well accepted, but it meant that we were salient and relevant. But now it's accepted that all our subsequent reports have been in that cycle. And our next report, 2010-20 report, will be the one which will be looking at the outcomes of the fifth environmental action program, of the sixth environmental action program. So this synchronization with a political relevancy is fundamental. The third one relates to the methodology and who you involve. Legitimacy is really very important. If you don't have legitimacy in the assessment, then nobody's going to listen. You may be the most wonderful scientists, you may be most relevant to their discourse, but if you have no legitimacy, then you won't be listened to. And the example I give here is a report done by, I think it was the Dutch WWF fraction of the WWF about orangutans. They took it to some countries in Southeast Asia, and they said, look, you know, you need to look at this report. The orangutans are dying. And the guy said, who made this report? Oh, we made the report. Where are you from? We're from Holland. Okay, well, bring back a report which is done by my ministry, by my nationals, and then maybe I'll look at it. But you have no legitimacy to write about our problems. Thank you very much. Go away. You know, legitimacy, whilst it's irrational, you could say, yeah, it's irrational, but it's really important when you come to trying to change behaviours and trying to alter the way people understand things. You've got to have that legitimacy. So understanding then how you run your process, which stakeholders you involve, is also fundamental to the practice of integrated environmental assessment. Being an expert is not the only type of important player in this. You've got to have the experts, but you've also got to have people who know about the impacts, perhaps. You've got to have people who know about local situations. You've got to have people who know about business. If you're going to have an assessment which is much more robust and it's going to be taken up, and then have legitimacy in those different domains. So legitimacy is a third characteristic of effective assessments. We have subsequently actually added to this and said that we also identify that accessibility is also a very important characteristic of effective assessments. And what that means is access to the data, because if it's just a book, something written, and people can actually drill down and get all the information and data, it's quite difficult. Nowadays, of course, accessibility is very easy with digitization and the internet. It's very simple to do. But when you're doing the assessment, it's not so simple to connect the assessment to all of those graphs and data. But the greater you have the read across from your report into the data and underpinning information, the better you're going to have and the more effective. And these are some characteristics of striving to be credible, salient, and legitimate. These are some of the characteristics that you can use as a checklist when you do an integrated environmental assessment. You want to basically look across thematic issues, across scales geographically, past, present, and future, stakeholder perspective, multidisciplinary, decision-making, and transparency. So this is kind of a checklist you can go through to say, what am I doing in this process in order to be transparent? Oh, I'm not doing anything. Well, you need to decide. So it's kind of a checklist of issues. So you try to have a good mix of those characteristics. They can sometimes be a trade-off also amongst these things, but you've got to be simply aware of those trade-offs. Be clear about them. So that's very much a lot of the what's and the underpinnings. Now I'm going to just say a little bit about the why, the whys. I've just done the what's. I'm just going to talk about the whys, and then go a little bit into the how and some challenges. So let's just think a little bit more about why it is we do integrated systems. I've actually touched upon this a little bit. I talked about systemic issues, but let's just reflect a little bit more deeply about this. This is the framework that we use at the European Environment Agency to look at the environment. Now, we think it's pretty normal, this sort of figure here. We have the ecosystems like this, and we have inside it the social technical systems, which are all those things that we do, with to do with transportation, to do with agriculture, urban cities, and so on and so forth. We do those, of course, within the Earth, within the capacity of ecosystems. And there's certain resources and ecosystem services, if you like that term, in inverted commas, which support those activities. And there are those wastes and emissions going out into. And of course, the circular economy concept is to make sure that we close that loop and we don't end up taking and giving. But it's not so obvious that that is the approach. We first published a similar type of thing in the 1999 report, the Turn of the Century report. And it was on a back page, on page 39 or something, not very prominently, because we didn't think it would be well accepted. And here it is. It's the same idea. Economies, societies, and environments. There are no economies, there are no societies without an environment. That was the idea. But this was regarded in 1999 as radical. And we felt the need to hide it a little bit. Because if we come out with that, then, oh, no, sorry, you can't look at that in that way. Now it's regarded as kind of normal. Again, don't assume that the people you're working with will also take that. This very simple approach by saying everything we do in our socio-technical systems depends upon the society and the environment in which it's embedded. It's fundamental, it's simple, it's obvious, but it's controversial. So that was an approach. We were inspired by Prescott Allen Smith, which I need to recognize here, who was the first person who put that down, and he talked about it as the egg model of sustainable development, published it as part of when he was working in IUCN, the state of the world there. It's a very important kind of shift in paradigm, Gestalt shift. It's one of those. Oh, that's the way the world works. We used to use this one. And we still do sometimes, but it actually gives the impression that you have some of the economy and some of the social which is outside of sustainable development. Sustainable development is a little bit in the middle. And maybe when impacts were not so great, you could imagine the world like that. But nowadays, to think that you can have these separate Olympic rings and you could do your bit of society out there which has nothing to do with the economy or nothing to do with the environment is a nonsense. Now, all of those things have been brought together in this form here. So stop using this one, I would say. Just don't use that anymore. Huh? It's very misleading, very misleading. So this is what we use to frame the dynamics in a social system, in a whole system which the politics is effectively addressing, to understand how we can change those systems to ensure that we are living well within the limits of the planet, to quote the 7th Environmental Action Programme. Earlier I said the 6th when I said the 2020 report. Of course, I'm talking about the 7th Environmental Action Programme that is evaluating, or at least looking at the results of. Now, so we have that then framing. We have to recognize that there's been, though, a shift of understanding over time. Again, think of Kuhn, the shift of understanding. And this is one of the graphs tables we published in an earlier, I think it was the 2010 or the 2015 report, 2010 report, I think initially, where we had to point out that the way in which we understood and saw issues actually evolved over time. And some people are still at this first stage of understanding that environmental issues are about point sources. Clean up that river, stop polluting, stop dropping litter, things are all point source. And a lot of people are stuck in that paradigm, haven't yet moved to the next level, which is actually, things are pretty diffuse. Maybe if you put some pesticide on some land or some fertilizer, it's going to diffuse out. And it's not so easy. You've got to work out the rivers and what's happening to the plants and the animals and so that's a kind of another step. And when that step occurred, the type of assessments and type of policies shifted. So initially you could have targeted policies and targeted assessments. When we were looking more at the diffuse issues, we had more policy integration issues. We said, we've got to integrate environment into agriculture, for example. Now we're firmly in this, actually we were always in the systemic area. It's to do with our understanding of these issues. We're now fully in the understanding that all the issues we're dealing with are actually systemic. There's some connectivity between them. And to just tackle one part of an issue, one point source, is not going to resolve the issues. Water pollution is a systemic issue. Connects many, many different things together. Climate change clearly is a systemic issue. So now what we need in this area, we need certainly an integrated environmental assessment, which is really truly integrative. But also we need then policy coherence. We've got to make sure the policies are not contradicting each other. So policy analysis is part of the whole domain of integrated assessment. You need to have a proper policy and policy integration analysis. So that shift is extremely important, and this is also why we need integrated environmental assessment. We need it because we're working with systemic issues. And this is just another way of thinking of them in terms of the different strands in a rope. We've understood these different aspects at different stages. And still, at the moment, sometimes people say, oh, let's just talk about the transport issue at the moment, or let's just talk about this. That can't happen. You have to talk about things all together. And there was this shift in '98, which is the integration process. The Cardiff process was called, where environment in consideration of the policy, the sectoral policy, was really important. And it's still an important thread to make sure that environment and the sectoral policies are properly integrated. But it's not the whole thread. Another thread, the Millennium Assessment, very much talked about resilience, sustainability, and equity. Really first put those three things together when they kicked off in around 2000, and the reports coming out around 2005. But again, other threads do equity now, resilience, together with sustainability. And then through that and many other studies, other types of issues to do with scales, the local scale, the mesoscale, the global scale. We need to look at things also in these different levels as well. So integrated assessment is to do with looking at these different scales and identifying which is it you need to do and bringing them together. So these are different dimensions, and these are different reasons why you need to have integrated assessment. Another aspect to look at is the policy cycle. So that if we are supporting the framing of new environmental policies, the tracking of those and decision making, we've got to recognize that policies aren't just at one stage of development. They also have their development cycle, like the Kuhnian cycle. There's often an issue which is identified. There's some sort of framing around that. I mentioned about water, for example. Policy measure is identified. The policy measure is then developed and adopted politically. You then have an implementation of that policy measure, an evaluation of that effectiveness, and then maybe a re-evaluation of the issue. Now, at all those different stages, you need different type of knowledge and data. You don't need the same knowledge at the same place. You've got to understand where you are in the cycle. To be effective, you've got to have a knowledge of where you are in the policy cycle. And of course, it's not as simple as that. It's a lot more complex. But it's just to say, beware of the policy cycle. When you write integrated environmental assessment, think about, are you at the earliest framing stages? Or are you at the implementation stage, where you're showing that the policy is not actually showing the results? Or are you actually going to be at a Gestalt shift and go around the whole thing again to say, actually, we've got to get away from just water quality. You've got to look at the basins, for example. So understand where you are in that policy cycle. So that's some reflections on why it is we do this. Now, how? There's a lot to say about the how. I've already mentioned some aspects. For example, to do with effective assessments, you need to involve different types of stakeholders. So there's talking about a how there. But I want to just make some more fundamental reflections about this, because how we do things very much depends upon our mental models. And often we are unaware of those mental models. We just assume that everyone else thinks the same way, don't we, until we talk with each other. And our mental model approximates the real world, and hopefully the real world gives us feedback to say it's not quite the way it is, and we adjust the mental model. At least sensible human beings tend to do that. But we don't always do that, because we're human beings and we make assumptions about things. And sometimes we are stubborn and don't want to change the way we see things. We need to recognize that simply. So let's look at this, for example. So assessment approaches are actually shaped by a mental model of how knowledge is developed. Have you thought about that? Where does the knowledge come from? And the MDIAK framework again something which we developed in the early days, was to ensure that we understood explicitly where we were in the development of knowledge. Data is data. Where does it come from? Well, data usually comes from monitoring. It can also come from statistics and mathematical models, of course. So M is monitoring and maybe models too. It's to do with making measurements and producing data. And in the early days, a lot of state environment reports were compendiums of data. I've got many examples in my office, which I've just been clearing out at the moment. A lot of data reports with tables and numbers. And of course, you look at those and you think, hey, wonderful. And if you're a data nerd, you love those things. But it doesn't tell you about the environment in terms of what to do and what's going on. They're important. You need to convert it into some information. You need to interpret that in some way. We use indicators sometimes. This is called indicators in the middle. Indicators interpret around a particular target, perhaps. But we need to put it into some type of context, and that's the policy decision-making context for integrated environmental assessment. Assessment means you go to the next stage. I've already mentioned what assessment means. You're bringing many things together, and you're looking at those consequences in a broader, integrated way. And the knowledge is to do with the reflection of really what is the meaning of that. And there's different things at different stages, and not everything goes in that line. You can have connections between them. Be self-aware of where you stand along this line and what you need to create in order to do an assessment. You need to create a process which goes from maybe a D to a K. Work out what does that mean. Again, the DPSR model, assessment approaches shape our mental models of how to structure and analyze environmental issues. So this model is also controlling the way we think about it. So also don't take this as it's only a mental model. It's an approximation of reality. It's not the reality of the head of the Geological Service in the 1920s who said, my model doesn't predict horizontal movements, so there is no such thing as plate tectonics. Don't make that mistake. DPSR is simply a model. It helps us think, but think outside that box as well. Don't be controlled by it. It's helpful, but it's not a model of the environment. It's much more complex than that. So be self-aware of that. And also, in terms of what we now talk about, systemic character, we have an understanding of what does systemic mean. And we might get stuck also on that. Systemic issues are very complex issues. There's many different aspects to them. Don't get caught in one particular definition. Understand and involve that. Unpick it a little bit. Don't assume that you know everything about it because it's more complex than you think. So again, beware of how our mental models have changed things. So all of these points address the how we do integrated environmental assessment. Yes, rely upon these frameworks to support your thinking, but when you're learning to walk again after you've broken your leg and you have a frame to support your thinking, eventually you want to go without it and walk free of that. And then you can understand better the full nature of the issue. So the how is maybe hobbling along with a stick and then getting rid of it and then maybe flying. Has to do with the how. Another aspect which is worth reflecting is also the development in time across the different years that the issues have been produced. So this is a timeline of our state environment reports in the agency. I've already mentioned the 95 and 99 report, and some of the later ones, as I said, have all been related to now the evolving environmental action plans of the European Union. This has only really been successful because we managed to develop a narrative. And the narrative around the assessments to say how they're related to the objectives of these different environmental action programs, which became more and more aspirational and less we must reduce by 20% or something like that. Then we needed also to match our assessment with a narrative of the policy or show the mismatch. I'm not saying you fix the assessment, I'm saying you've got to match the way you do things. So there's been an increased understanding that the stories that you tell, when we first said we were going to tell stories in assessment, people said, sorry, you're scientists. Now actually you've got to tell a story, bring the scientific information into a narrative. Very important if you're going to support particularly more sophisticated assessment programs like the 7th Environmental Action Programme is. So there's been a very big shift in assessments, in integrated assessments, towards a narrative. Doesn't mean you could do away with all the data tables. No, it's to do with how you maybe present things up front. None of this is to do with doing away with the fundamentals, it's building on those fundamentals. So now, I'll conclude with a few current challenges. So that's kind of very quickly a tour of some historical developments and some key themes that you can delve into more deeply, hopefully later. But let's just reflect upon some of the challenges which we now face today. This is a graph we are using quite a lot at the moment about the EU context, how we have a lot of issues where there are targets up to 2020, and that seems such a long way away that we felt that was sufficient and then we'll be able to be successful. But now we have 2030 targets, and now that's okay, it's a long time. Well, actually, for most issues, particularly if they're systemic and long-term, you've got to talk about 2050, if not 2100, as your perspective, as your aim, in order to fix the issues and problems. So this long-term issue is fundamental and as a challenge to integrated assessment, because what tools do we have to really think in the long term there without being too reliant only on mathematical models which think they can extrapolate out to that time. They can contribute to the discussion, certainly, very much so, but they can't be just the end result. How in all of these issues, I've talked about how these issues are now framed very much in an integrative way, a systemic way. They're often developing and they're iterative, like the circular economy, climate, and the EU energy union kind of approach. These things are interacting with each other, and more we're thinking of systemic issues, the more we have to read across between these large policies, and not all of these policies are environmental policies. The energy union policy is an energy policy, in which environment has to be properly part of the whole affair. So the developing an iterative nature of the policies is making a very complex political background against which to write integrated environmental assessments. And because of that, we're lacking a lot of the knowledge that is required. So we also got to consider what investments we need to make for the future for getting that type of knowledge, which can also be research, but maybe we need to make surveys, maybe we need to involve stakeholders. There's other types of things we need to do to understand into the future. And an explicit recognition of these knowledge gaps are already in the 7th Environmental Action Programme. I think in the discussion around the SDGs, initially there was a discussion to say, yes, we are really missing a lot of things. But now there tends to be no, we have the indicators, now we can just track the indicators. We've got to recognize that we don't have all the information at all. We're in terra incognito often in some of these areas. And I remember the head of the European Statistical Service was basically saying for the SDGs, we have terra incognito on the map. We need to develop new knowledge and understandings in order to plot our progress. So because of this long-termism, we have big challenges towards integrated environmental assessment. The approaches that we have also, at the bottom right-hand corner, in terms of methods and models that we've got, are also in this context challenged. We have the DPSI approach, we have the so-called STEEP approach, society, technology, environment, economics, and policy, which is a really interesting checklist approach. We have certain indicators, environmental accounting. So there's a number of challenges of bringing these different domains together, because often the experts in environmental accounting don't necessarily talk to, or not maybe respected by, other members who are maybe working on scenario scanning. And these people have to talk with each other. So there are different silos of experts, but there's also areas which need to be developed further. So this is also challenging the methodologies and approaches which we have at our disposal. There's also some new dynamics going on. I thought I'd try to give this lecture without talking about alternative facts or false truths or my truth and your truth, but this is the world we're living in at the moment, isn't it? This talks very much to pedigree, as I talked about before. Yes, people have their own opinions and different ideas and facts, but there's different pedigrees to people's opinions, and it's not the same as scientific information. So there is a new dynamic between science, policy, and society, which we see playing out today as we speak, which we need to be very relevant to, we need to be very attentive to, and understand what is it about what we do, and I would argue this to do with pedigree, that makes sure that our information, our knowledge is recognized and understood, and not just seen to be your or our opinion about the topic. It's something more fundamental than that. And the increases of knowledge complexity I mentioned, solutions, responses, more complex system processes, and organizational management of these issues are all things that need to be looked at. And this last point, how we manage organizationally these different things, was also behind one of the things we looked at our new reorganization. The European Environment Agency is going through a reorganization. And why are we reorganizing? We're reorganizing so that we can produce better integrated environmental assessments. And so organizing and managing these things is part of our daily work, and probably part of your daily work. And it's to do with personnel management, it's to do with training, learning and development, all these other things which are not to do with necessarily to do with science, but the impact upon our ability to do integrated environmental assessment. And it's important we get them right. Although I wouldn't say there's a right and a wrong, we must improve continuously and incrementally. There is not one solution to trying to deal with all of these points. This is the graph which talks about, the picture that talks about when society should worry when geeks have to demonstrate, which is to do with the whole false truths, alternative facts idea. But underneath this, also, if you look at the right-hand graphic there, why are you telling me all this? We don't need any more. There's this also sense of sometimes, oh, we've got enough assessments. Oh, come on, not another assessment saying there's a problem. You know, you've told us already before, go away. There's an overburden. There's too much information out there these days, and also alternative type of information. So we've got to be aware of that and properly target messages and our information in an appropriate manner. So we don't just overburden people and say, okay, come on, we've heard this all before, and we have too much to deal with already. It's quite important to produce effective assessments. We've really got to understand these implications. This is to demonstrate the interesting graph which talks about the number of framing questions in different type of multi-topic assessments. And if you look at that from the, I think it goes from the mid-80s to today, we discover that there are more and more framing questions embedded in assessments, which is a very good measure of the increase in complexity of our assessments. And the more framing questions that there are, the more lost you get in the assessment as well. So we've got to be aware of overburdening ourselves with those sort of assessments. But how do you do that without giving up some integration? If you've got to be fully integrated, you've got to do everything together. But you can't do everything together. So there are trade-offs. So the number of framing questions, be very explicit about in your assessments how many you are using in order to simplify as much as possible. The challenge about narratives is very important as well. This is just to show that over time, I've mentioned already how the narrative approach is very important. This is a major challenge to how we carry things out. The network that we have, IONET, is fundamental to improving these narratives, because the narratives are not just European narratives, they're local narratives, they're country narratives, they're expert narratives, and non-expert narratives as well. And how to do that in a system is not straightforward. So that's another big challenge we have to look at. And we need to be transparent and seem to be transparent about soliciting other people's views, not just showing that we're doing it. We've actually got to be very convincing about that, which increases the legitimacy. And that is very challenging, how to do that, how it is we interact with other stakeholders. Managing assessments and the different types of assessments is a challenge in itself. How to manage those assessments together, once you've also delivered them, how to bring them together and communicate them, is a major challenge when there's many on the table. Two last slides. We're responding in different ways to these types of challenges. I can't give you an overview of that, but these are some issues that we have looked at and tried to design our assessments around. Being reflexive and responsive to changes, being explicit about assumptions, strengthening and adapting our assessment approaches as we learn as well is extremely important. Pragmatism versus theory, getting a proper balance there, and recognizing that we're part of a system and a community of assessors and other actors as well, and trying to design our assessments around those. So those are some key things which we've done, and these are some of the issues which we'll be exploring in the summer school. And you'll be looking at where those can affect the way in which you could design assessments. Some final reflections. Effectively integrated assessment is a tool for navigating the complexity and uncertainty of systems. I mentioned about the post-normal science framework. It's quite important that we understand it as simply a tool for navigating that. The conversation goes on outside that, but it's a tool for that. In carrying out integrated assessments, we've got to maintain a humility. We are knowing certain things about these problems. We don't know the answers. Maintaining humility is extremely important, and to say what you don't know. Being proactive and understanding that the assessment, the report itself, is not the end result, it is how it's used. So designing an assessment around a process, which is probably an ongoing process, understanding how the results can be taken up and communicated is all important for its effectiveness. Collaboration, co-creation will create wider ownership. That's the legitimacy issue, which I mentioned earlier. Very important to ensure that we have a proper collaboration and co-creation process. And then finally, being policy relevant really requires that we engage more with others about solutions, not just the problems themselves. And this narrative approach really takes us into understanding how integrated assessments can also address solutions. That kind of concludes. I hope I've dipped into many different ideas here. Probably opened up more questions than I've answered any, but I hope I've teased you a little bit into reading some other things in the future, and if you have any questions, I'm very happy to answer them. Thank you.